Much of the history of Westfield can be best understood by thinking about water. It was water and the beaver that lived in them that brought the first settlers here. It was water and the rich lands of the river bottoms that kept them here in a farming community. It was water resources that led to the development of numerous mills that brought prosperity to the community. It was water that led to the first transit system, the Farmington Canal, that opened up Westfield to Long Island Sound. And it was water that created disaster after disaster during the first 300 years of Westfield history. That's part of the reason why the original name for this community was Springfield. In fact, the name Westfield was given to it by the proprietors from Springfield some years later. But Springfield it was, and Springfield it remained for a long time. When you're talking about Westfield and Westfield history, you're really talking about a very small area. Now, this is a map of the total town of Westfield. But in fact, for the first 300 years, most of what was Westfield was this peninsula right here between the two rivers. The Great River, or the Westfield River to the north, that drained 500 square miles of the Berkshires, and the Little River to the south that drained another 100 square miles. Topographic history is the key to Westfield history because this peninsula, which was the settled area of Westfield, has an average elevation of only 120 to 150 feet above sea level. Immediately to the north, south, and west of that peninsula, the land rises sharply to up to about 200 feet of elevation. And then in a mile to the west, the land sharply rises 1,000 or 2,000 feet. That means that everything to the west, the north, and the south, all the water that drains from that higher elevation drains into this peninsula. In fact, when the settlers came here, most of this peninsula was a spruce swamp. And it remained that way until the 19th century, until nearly 200 years after the original settlement. In fact, the current center of Westfield, around the green, or the concrete as it is today, that was not the center of town until 150 years after the original settlement, because it was underwater for much of that period of time. All of the housing of Westfield, from Broad Street on the south, Mill Street on the west, Court Street on the north, and Silver Street on the south, that was a swamp. Now, not only were the two rivers key to the waterworks, but there were a series of major streams that also provided water. There was Moose Meadow Brook on the west. That drained Montgomery Mountain, and it was the first water that was controlled for city water from the city reservoirs. There was Sackett Brook, sometimes today called Powder Mill Brook, and Arm Brook, which drained the area of Montgomery Mountain, Wyben, Middle Farms, paralleled Union Street, and flowed into the Westfield River at what was called the Frog Pond. There was also Pond Brook, which drained all the area of Hamden Ponds, paralleled East Mountain Road, and again flowed into the Westfield River at the Frog Pond. In the south, there was the Great Brook, which drained Congamon Lakes in Southwick and flowed into the Westfield River. And, now long forgotten, there were two internal streams on the peninsula itself, one of which began under the cemetery on Pine Hill, Smith Avenue, Grandmother's Garden, flowed down parallel King Street, crossed Washington under what is today the Washington Street Housing for the Elderly, paralleled School Street, then crossed School Street and paralleled Elm Street, flowed under where the courthouse is today, and then followed Bartlett Street to run into the Westfield River. The other stream was called the Spruce Brook Stream, and that drained that area of housing that I've outlined between Court and Sylvan. It flowed across Broad Street, draining at the same time a stream that flowed under the present First Congregational Church, then paralleled Silver Street, crossed Noble, and ran into the Little River. Now, those two latter streams have been totally forgotten today. They still flow through the city, but they were channelized. Their channels were dug deeper, they were bricked over, and they continued to flow, draining the area of Pine Hill. They still create problems for some people's housing today. But as late as the 1870s, there were bridges on Broad Street, Noble Street, Mechanic Street, and Meadow Street. Bridges that were washed out every spring. Salmon were caught behind the police department on Washington Street in the 1850s. There were swimming holes on Franklin Street, Bartlett Street, and on Pleasant Street at Pearl. And as late as the 1930s, a swimming hole continued to exist on Cortez Street, right at the base of Noble Hospital Hill. All of that water created both opportunity and occasional disaster for the people of Westfield. With all of those water resources that I spoke about, one of the realities of Westfield history is you had to have bridges. And one of the most interesting features of the bridges is that there were 6 different covered bridges that provided crossing points of the rivers and streams in Westfield. Now, we're very lucky in that we have some photographs of those bridges, because a few of them at least lasted until late in the 19th century. Now, the most important river and the most important crossing point was, of course, the Great River, or the Westfield River, to the north. The town of Westfield had developments both north and south of the river, so getting across that river was a real problem, particularly during the spring and fall of the year, when water would flow down from the Berkshire Mountains and create perpetual floods in downtown Westfield. Any bridge that you built on the Great River in the 18th and early 19th century was prone to being swept away, because literally overnight the river could rise as much as 20 feet and destroy everything in its path. It wasn't until 1840 that the first permanent bridge was built on that river. Now, that's 200 years after the settlement of Westfield. Prior to that time, there were temporary bridges. There was even a town-sponsored ferry there for a few years. But in 1840, they built a massive covered bridge on piers across the river, roughly in the same place that a bridge crosses the river today. Now, this is an image of that covered bridge. You are on the north side looking south, and obviously it doesn't look right. Here is a railroad crew working on the tracks. What you have to realize is that the railroads, north and south, and east and west, that ran through Westfield, disturbed the horse-drawn traffic. those tracks were flat and level with the roadbeds. And particularly for the north-south traffic, that meant crossing numerous streets and creating numerous potentials for disaster. In 1895, the tracks, both north and south and east and west, were elevated up on the dike-like barriers that exist today. This picture is taken from roughly the spot of the Pure Foods grocery store on the north side. In 1895, what they did is they excavated underneath it. And this is the more familiar look of what you're seeing. If you think about coming into town from the north, obviously the road goes down into a great hollow there and up the other side to a bridge. So that what looks like flat ground here disappears. Now that bridge survived until 1879, when the worst flood that ever struck Westfield hit, and it washed away the abutments of that bridge. The decision was made to replace it with a more permanent and sturdier structure. And so in 1880, a steel bridge was built. This crossed the river at roughly the same point. It had been raised higher and was less prone to flooding. You can see on the bridge on the left the horse-drawn trolley going north to the trolley barns which existed right at the base of Clay Hill. Another feature of that bridge and the river in that section is that the river from its very earliest days was dammed to provide water power. This is a good view of the dam that was under the bridge. Now, putting a dam there created problems all its own, because that meant that it held back water, which caused flooding upstream. That led to the need to build dikes, the famous dikes that are upstream above Orange Street and Shepherd Street. But most of that country, all the way up the river to Russell, is flat and low-lying. So every time you built a dike, you simply moved the flooding further upstream. Most of the time it didn't matter very much, because that was farmland, and the floods came and went on a regular basis, but they came and went very fast. Usually within 2 or 3 days the water was gone, no real harm was done. But there was a constant danger that building those dikes could mean that in exceptional years the dikes or the dam itself might break. Now, as I said, the dam, which you can see clearly here, provided water power. These are the Horton Mills, which were on the north side of the river. The Horton Mills were various grain, mostly for production of grinding grain. The Horton Mills survived until the late 19th century, when they burned. The buildings themselves were finally torn down in 1930, and various other structures have occupied that site since. Today, that's roughly the location where the northbound bridge crosses the river. On the south side, there were also mills. This is the Van Dusen Whip Factory, which existed on the south side. It occupied the area that was called Kane Park, and then eventually was cleared to become the southern terminus of the current bridge that was built in 2005 to go north. This dam, these mills, created problems of their own, because the mills had intake valves at their base. That meant that the walls of the riverbank at their base were always potentially weak, and in particularly severe floods, the banks would be undercut. In 1938, the abutment of this bridge was so badly damaged, and the walls of this building were undercut so badly that the building was torn down and a new bridge had to be constructed. That bridge in 1938 is the bridge which crosses the Westfield River today. The other major bridge needing major attention because it was a major communication route was the east-west route to West Springfield and Springfield ultimately, Route 20. This is the county bridge on Route 20 at Frog Hole. Now, remember I talked about all the streams of the north draining into Frog Hole. That's a large swampy area that can be seen to the right as you're entering Westfield, where you cross the current concrete bridge. And because there was always water there, and because in particular times of the year you had so much water coming, there was always potential damage to this bridge. This bridge was constructed in 1864. Now you are on the West Springfield side looking back into Westfield in this image. On the right is where Union Street comes into Route 20. This area always was a potential for problems. And in the Great Flood of 1878, this bridge was washed off its pillars, and amazingly, it stayed intact and was carried downstream towards West Springfield about 300 or 400 yards. When the flood subsided, they simply hooked oxen onto this structure, pulled it back onto the pillars, lifted it up, and put it back in place. It continued to serve as a successful bridge until 1896 in January. Now, it was never explained how or why, but somehow in the dead of winter, this wooden structure caught fire and burned to the ground. Now, obviously, in the days without electricity, with no sources of fire in the area, it seems pretty clear somebody burned it. And this is what remained of the pillars when it was all over with. It was replaced with an iron bridge, which remained as the central bridge coming into Westfield until 2002, when the new concrete construction, which is out there today. Now, the 1878 flood also destroyed the third of the covered bridges. Unfortunately, we have no photographs of that bridge, but there was another covered bridge on the Great River, the Westfield River. It was called Morley's Bridge, and it existed on the Westfield-West Springfield line, crossing the river to Agawam. It was about across from the small restaurant on the line called Little George's. There is an evangelical Russian church right on the bend of the river there, and that bridge crossed into Agawam. It was never replaced. Because the river narrows there as it goes through the gorge and the hill into West Springfield, there was a lot of controversy that the bridge and its abutments created flood potential, and so it was never replaced. The fourth covered bridge is again one that most people don't think of. This was called the Town Bridge. It was on Route 20 also, and it crossed the Little River. This is on East Main Street, just before Westfield Shops. Just as you leave the residential area of Westfield, going east, you cross the Little River on a concrete bridge today. But there was a covered bridge there also. That covered bridge lasted until 1898. In 1898, that covered bridge was torn down and construction began on an iron bridge. Now in this image, right to the right of that derrick is a house which exists on East Main Street today. It's called the Loomis House. As you're coming into Westfield, you'll notice this is a Dutch colonial. It's a very distinctive home. You can clearly see the location where this new bridge was built. And this is the little iron bridge that crossed the Little River, right at the spot where the Little River enters the Westfield River. In 1951, that bridge was replaced by the current concrete structure, which today has the name of Veterans Bridge. Again, it's a bridge that you don't really notice anymore. You can drive over it and think you're on a highway. But once upon a time, there were very clear breaks of getting into and out of Westfield. So this is the fourth of the covered bridges. The fifth was on the south side of the city. This is the Horton Bridge. This marks the route by the Crane Upper Mill, originally called the Stevens Mill, and the road that goes to Granville. This bridge was originally constructed in 1835, and it survived until 1913, when it had deteriorated so much that it was again replaced by a concrete structure. Now, it was called the Horton's Bridge because early in the 19th century, the Horton family had a gunpowder mill in this section of the river. It's the same reason that the paper mill was built today. There is an area for a dam and water power on the river. The sixth bridge is called the Coles Bridge, named for William Coles, who lived on Mill Street, and he was famed as a covered bridge builder. He built covered bridges all across western Massachusetts, and this was one of his constructions. Now, this bridge, its antecedents are probably in the 1820s. This is the bridge that crosses the Little River at Crane Mills and goes to Southwick. This is on Route 202 and 10. And what you're doing is you're looking towards the Southwick side in this image. Now, this bridge is going to last until 1916. Here's another image of that bridge. This is along towards the end of its life, and it's beginning to look a little ratty here. This image is important because if you look to the left, right under the bridge, you'll see a rail car, and if you look very, very closely, you can see that there are railroad tracks there. And if you think about it a minute, that initially doesn't make any sense. But you have to keep in mind that the Crane paper mills were just above this bridge. And in the 19th century, you had to get production materials into the mills and finished paper out of the mills. And just south on Broad Street and the extension of Broad Street was where the north-south railroad line ran, the Hartford and New Haven railroad tracks. So this was a spur track that ran along the Westfield, the Little River, up to those mills supplying materials. Here's another image of that bridge. Again, you're looking toward Southwick from the Westfield side. The bridge is in pretty sorry shape by this time. And in 1916, they're going to rebuild it. They tore the old covered bridge down and began to replace it with a concrete structure. Now here you're looking toward Mill Street. On the right-hand side, that large building in the background is the building that people in Westfield may know as the Grange Building. But in fact, at this point in time, in 1916, it was a schoolhouse. It was a schoolhouse for the workers in the mills. Here's another shot of the construction. In the background, you can see the concrete bridge is starting to take shape. But while they were constructing that, they had to provide transportation for the people coming from the south into town. So they used the timbers from the old covered bridge and built a temporary bridge to the west. You can see it in this photo with a horse and buggy crossing. Luckily, in those days, they didn't have tractor trailers. There is no way you could have gotten any heavy piece of equipment across this temporary bridge. I find it amazing that even if you were riding in a Model T in that day, you would have tried it. This is very temporary indeed. And here, of course, is the finished bridge, but what's particularly important here is there very prominently in the foreground are the railroad tracks, because Stevens Mills or Crane Mills still needed outlets for its supplies. And even though we're now in the era of the automobile, train cars are the most efficient way to get supplies into town. Now this then is the history of the 6 covered bridges that took care of the major entrances and exits of the city of Westfield. But there are a couple of other minor bridges that are at least interesting. This is one that answers a question that I've received many times. If you leave Westfield on Route 20 going towards West Springfield, there's a short stretch in which the Route 20 is very close to the Westfield River. Just before you hit the town line, almost across from Lane Quarry on your left, on your right-hand side, there's a pull-off where you can park alongside the river. If you do, you'll notice that there's an odd steel structure in the riverbank. And a number of people have wondered what that structure is all about, what it's for. Well, you can see the structure on the right-hand side of this picture. In 1905, there was a decision made to put a reservoir on top of Proven Mountain in Agawam, which is directly across the river at that point in time. Westfield and West Springfield had a trolley line for communication. So it was very easy for workers from Springfield to take the trolley out to Westfield, get off the trolley right about there, and then cross the river to go up on Proven Mountain to work, if they had a way of getting across the river. And so they built a suspension bridge across the river right at that point in time so that workers could go to their construction site. Obviously, this was not open to the general public and obviously didn't last very long, but it solved the problem of dealing with Westfield's watershed. And this is another example, as I told you, of how the rivers were both a resource and a problem. One of the main features of water in Westfield was the canal. The canal flowed through the town following the water courses. After the railroads came and the canal was not used for transportation anymore, it continued to be used for water power. Most importantly, in the whip factories that were on Elm Street at the head of Franklin. So the town brook, which was that brook that drained a great part of the city, provided the canal's water at that source. During the Great Flood of 1878, the flood destroyed much of the business and industry in that section of town because the waters flowed through the Great Brook. It also destroyed the railroad line that flowed through the town. This photo shows a spot where the railroad line is being replaced, and that those stone abutments that you see in the middle of the picture were where the railroad crossed the canal. When I first saw this picture, the owner of it asked me if I could figure out where it was. I was able to do so because of that house in the background. That house survives to this day on Burge Avenue, which runs behind St. Mary's School. If you follow Burge Avenue, a very short street to the end, that house is on the end. This stream flowed through the St. Mary's Catholic Church School parking lot and crossed Mechanic Street right there where there was a bridge. This house, this bridge, shows the canal, shows the flood, and shows the damages that the interior streams could create in Westfield. As late as the 1920s, the city of Westfield was still providing the upkeep and the repairs to nearly 40 bridges in the city of Westfield. Many of those bridges have since disappeared as the water courses have been channelized, put underground, run through culverts, and specifically as the waters upstream have disappeared. The Westfield River has been dammed in a number of places, as has the Little River, and the cutting of the forests in the mountains have meant that water retention and the flow through those streams has deteriorated enormously. But in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, the rivers and streams of Westfield provided both opportunity and danger to the city.